Final Fantasy is unusual compared to almost every other long-running game series. Most franchises build continuity. They create a timeline, or a shared universe, or at least recurring characters that evolve across sequels. Final Fantasy does something completely different. Each numbered entry is its own world, its own rules, its own mythology. Final Fantasy I is not connected to Final Fantasy II in any direct narrative way. Final Fantasy VII does not take place in the same universe as Final Fantasy X. And yet, despite this lack of direct continuity, players still recognize a shared identity across the entire series. This is because Final Fantasy is not built on story continuity. It is built on thematic continuity. Recurring ideas appear again and again: crystals, summons, airships, empires, journeys, loss, identity, and transformation. These elements act less like lore connections and more like emotional language. Each game is essentially a different interpretation of the same core feelings, and because of that, the series has been able to reinvent itself for decades without losing its identity. To understand how this became possible, we need to start at the very beginning. Final Fantasy I, a game built on limitation and survival. We begin with Final Fantasy I. Released in 1987, Final Fantasy I was not originally intended to become the foundation of a long-running franchise. At the time, Square was facing serious financial pressure. The video game industry in Japan was still unstable, and RPGs were not guaranteed commercial successes. Hironobu Sakaguchi, the director of the game, was reportedly considering leaving the industry entirely if this project failed. Because of this, the game was named Final Fantasy, not as branding for a series, but as a personal statement. A final attempt. A last effort to create something meaningful before potentially stepping away from game development. This emotional context is important because it shaped the design philosophy of the game in subtle ways. Final Fantasy I is extremely minimal compared to modern RPGs. The player controls a party known as the Warriors of Light. However, these characters have no personality, no dialogue, and no defined emotional identity. They are intentionally blank. This was not initially an artistic choice. It was a technical limitation. The NES hardware simply could not support large amounts of character writing or complex narrative systems. But this limitation created something interesting. Instead of telling the player who the characters are, the game allows the player to project identity onto them. The Warriors of Light become symbolic rather than literal. They are not individuals with defined personalities. They are roles being inhabited by the player's imagination. Another foundational element introduced in this game is the crystal system. The world is maintained by 4 elemental crystals: earth, fire, water, and wind. These crystals act as the structural backbone of the world. They are not deeply explained, but their presence creates a mythological structure that gives the world a sense of balance and fragility. Over time, this idea of crystals representing world stability becomes one of the most recurring motifs in the series. Even in later games where crystals are no longer central, the concept of a fragile world balance still remains. In many ways, Final Fantasy I is less of a fully realized narrative experience and more of a foundational blueprint for everything that comes after it. Final Fantasy II, the first step into character-driven storytelling. Now we move to Final Fantasy II. If Final Fantasy I is defined by abstraction and limitation, Final Fantasy II represents the first serious attempt to move beyond that abstraction. This game introduces named characters with established identities. Firion, Maria, Guy, and Leon are no longer blank avatars. They are individuals with relationships, emotions, and narrative roles. This shift is extremely important in the evolution of the series. For the first time, Final Fantasy begins to experiment with character-driven storytelling rather than purely system-driven gameplay. The narrative focuses on a war between the Palamasian Empire and a resistance group. This immediately creates a more grounded emotional structure compared to the abstract crystal journey of the first game. Characters can be lost permanently during the story, and relationships shift as the narrative progresses. There is also a stronger emphasis on political conflict, betrayal, and ideological difference. One of the most important narrative arcs involves Leon, who becomes separated from the main group and influenced by the opposing empire. When he reappears, he is no longer aligned with the party's goals. This introduces one of the earliest examples in Final Fantasy of ideological conflict within a party structure. Not all enemies are external. Some are former allies. From a gameplay perspective, Final Fantasy II also introduces one of the most unusual progression systems in the series. Instead of traditional experience points and level-ups, character growth is based on usage. Weapons improve through use, magic becomes stronger through repetition, health increases when damage is taken. This system was intended to create organic progression. In theory, it means that character growth reflects actual behavior in combat. However, in practice, the system was difficult to balance and often unpredictable. Players could unintentionally weaken their characters if they trained inefficiently or inconsistently. Despite its flaws, this system represents one of the earliest experimental attempts in the series to break away from standard RPG leveling mechanics. It shows a willingness from the developers to explore systems that feel more naturalistic, even if they are not fully refined. In hindsight, Final Fantasy II is often seen as an experimental bridge between abstraction and structure. It moves the series closer to narrative identity, but has not yet fully stabilized its design philosophy. Final Fantasy III, the system that defined a genre. We now move to Final Fantasy III. Final Fantasy III is often remembered less for its story and more for what it introduced structurally to the series, because this is the game where the job system truly becomes a core identity feature. Before this point, character roles in RPGs were relatively fixed. A warrior stayed a warrior, a mage stayed a mage, a healer stayed a healer. But Final Fantasy III introduced something far more flexible: the idea that characters could change roles entirely during the course of the game. The job system allowed players to switch between classes such as Knight, White Mage, Black Mage, Thief, and many others. This may sound standard today, but at the time, it was a major shift in RPG design philosophy. It meant that character identity was no longer fixed. It became modular, replaceable, rebuildable. This concept subtly changes how players think about progression. Instead of growing as one fixed identity, the player is encouraged to experiment with identity itself. From a narrative perspective, Final Fantasy III still maintains relatively simple character writing compared to later entries. The main characters are often referred to as the Onion Knights in later versions, but in the original structure, they are more symbolic than deeply individualized. What Final Fantasy III contributes most strongly is structural freedom. It is less focused on emotional storytelling and more focused on system experimentation. However, this experimentation becomes extremely important for later games, because without Final Fantasy III's job system foundation, Final Fantasy V would not exist in the same form. And without Final Fantasy V, many later RPG systems across the entire genre would not look the way they do today. In that sense, Final Fantasy III is not defined by its story, but by its influence. It is one of the earliest examples of Final Fantasy acting as a system laboratory rather than just a narrative experience. Final Fantasy IV, the birth of modern Final Fantasy. Storytelling. Now we move to Final Fantasy IV. If Final Fantasy III represents structural experimentation, Final Fantasy IV represents emotional and narrative maturity. This is the point where Final Fantasy begins to feel like a story-driven RPG in the modern sense. The main character, Cecil Harvey, is introduced as a Dark Knight serving the Kingdom of Baron. From the very beginning, the game establishes internal moral tension. Cecil is not portrayed as a heroic figure, He is portrayed as someone following orders in a system he does not fully question. This creates an immediate emotional conflict that runs through the entire game. One of the most important developments in Final Fantasy IV is how it handles pacing. The game is structured in a way that constantly shifts party composition. Characters join and leave frequently, and the narrative often re-centers around different perspectives. This creates a sense that the world is larger than the player's immediate viewpoint. One of the most iconic elements of Final Fantasy IV is Cecil's transformation from Dark Knight into Paladin. This is not just a class change in gameplay terms, it is a narrative reflection of internal moral conflict. The game ties identity directly to mechanical progression. Another key character is Kain Highwind, a dragoon. Kain's storyline introduces one of the earliest major examples of manipulation through external influence within the series. He is repeatedly pulled between loyalty, control, and personal autonomy. What makes this especially important is how it introduces the idea that even trusted party members are not emotionally stable constants. They can change. They can be influenced. They can betray the group under external pressure. This becomes a recurring Final Fantasy theme for decades afterward. From a technical perspective, Final Fantasy IV also introduced more cinematic storytelling for its time. Dialogue sequences became longer and more expressive. Emotional beats were more clearly staged, and character motivations were more explicitly written rather than implied. This game is often considered the moment where Final Fantasy transitions from RPG system with story elements into story-driven RPG with systems supporting it. Final Fantasy V, Systems over Story. Now, before we continue into Final Fantasy V in the next section, it is important to understand what Final Fantasy IV changed in the series as a whole. Because once the series shifted toward emotional storytelling, the next step was to explore the opposite direction again. Final Fantasy V returns heavily to systems design. It refines the job system introduced in Final Fantasy III and expands it into a far more flexible and expressive gameplay structure. But that shift will become clearer in the next section. For now, what matters is this transition point. Final Fantasy is no longer experimenting blindly. It now understands both narrative structure and system structure and begins alternating between them in different ways. Final Fantasy V, the purest expression of system design. We now move to Final Fantasy V. Final Fantasy V represents a very interesting turning point in the series because it intentionally shifts away from the heavier emotional storytelling introduced in Final Fantasy IV and instead focuses almost entirely on gameplay systems and mechanical expression. At its core, Final Fantasy V is built around the most refined version of the job system introduced in Final Fantasy III. But where Final Fantasy III experimented with jobs as a structural idea, Final Fantasy V turns them into a fully flexible system of identity construction. The player is no longer simply choosing a class for a character. They are combining systems together, mixing abilities from different jobs, creating hybrid roles that did not previously exist. For example, a character might combine the physical strength of a knight with the magical abilities of a black mage, or combine speed-based jobs like thief with support roles like time mage. This creates a level of customization that was extremely advanced for its time. But what makes Final Fantasy V particularly important is that it demonstrates something about the direction of the series. Not every Final Fantasy game is trying to tell a deeply emotional story. Some entries are more focused on mechanical creativity and system depth, and Final Fantasy V sits firmly in that category. The narrative itself is relatively straightforward compared to later entries. A group of heroes is brought together to stop a global threat connected to elemental forces and an ancient sealed power. But the storytelling takes a secondary role to gameplay experimentation. One interesting aspect of Final Fantasy V is how it subtly balances tone. Even though the story is lighter in emotional complexity compared to Final Fantasy IV, it still contains moments of loss, sacrifice, and danger. However, these moments are not the central focus. Instead, They support the gameplay journey rather than defining it. From a design perspective, Final Fantasy V is often considered one of the most mechanically influential games in the entire series. Many later RPG systems, including hybrid class systems in modern games, can trace conceptual lineage back to this entry. It represents Final Fantasy at its most system-driven state, a game that prioritizes player experimentation over narrative structure. Final Fantasy VI. The moment Final Fantasy becomes cinematic storytelling. Now we move to Final Fantasy VI. If Final Fantasy V represents systems refinement, Final Fantasy VI represents emotional and narrative expansion at a massive scale. This is one of the most important entries in the entire series, because this is the point where Final Fantasy fully embraces ensemble storytelling as its core identity. Instead of focusing on a single protagonist, Final Fantasy VI distributes narrative weight across a large cast of characters. Terra Bramford, Locke Cole, Celeste Cher, Edgar Figaro, Sabin Figaro, Cyan Garamonde, Shadow, Setsa Gabbiani, and many others all have significant narrative arcs. Each character is given emotional depth, personal motivation, and narrative relevance. This structure was extremely ambitious for the hardware of the time. The Super Nintendo had strict memory limitations, yet the developers still chose to include a large cast with individual storylines. One of the most defining structural moments in Final Fantasy VI occurs halfway through the game. The antagonist Kefka Palazzo succeeds in his goal. He destroys the world. This is not symbolic destruction, it is literal. The world map changes completely. Landscapes are destroyed, civilization collapses, and the tone of the game shifts dramatically. This is one of the earliest major examples in RPG history, where the midpoint of the game completely transforms the structure of the world itself. The second half of Final Fantasy VI is not about preventing disaster. It is about surviving after disaster has already occurred. Characters become separated. Some lose hope entirely. Others isolate themselves from society. And some attempt to rebuild meaning in a broken world. This structure creates a very different emotional pacing compared to most RPGs at the time. Instead of building toward a single climax, the game introduces a midpoint collapse followed by emotional reconstruction. From a narrative design perspective, this is extremely unusual for its era. Kefka himself is also one of the most philosophically distinct villains in the series. Unlike villains who seek power, control, or redemption, Kefka represents pure nihilism. He does not believe the world has meaning. He does not believe in structure, order, or purpose. He views existence itself as something to be destroyed. This makes him not just an antagonist in a physical sense, but an ideological counterpoint to the entire structure of the game's cast. Where the heroes search for meaning in loss, Kefka rejects meaning entirely. Another important aspect of Final Fantasy VI is its music composition. The soundtrack is widely considered one of the most emotionally influential in the series. It uses thematic repetition to reinforce character identity and emotional tone. Each character has associated musical motifs that appear during key story moments. This reinforces emotional memory without needing additional dialogue. From a technical standpoint, Final Fantasy VI is also one of the most advanced RPGs of its generation. It pushes the Super Nintendo hardware to its limits in terms of animation, world design, and narrative complexity. But more importantly, it represents a shift in what Final Fantasy is becoming. It is no longer just experimenting with systems or simple storytelling. It is beginning to merge both into a fully cinematic narrative experience. Why Final Fantasy VI matters so much before moving forward, it is important to understand why Final Fantasy VI is such a critical turning point, because everything after this point in the series begins to operate with a different expectation. Final Fantasy is no longer trying to figure out what it wants to be. It now understands that it can tell complex emotional stories while also maintaining deep gameplay systems. This is the foundation that later entries like Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy X, and Final Fantasy XIV build upon. Final Fantasy VI is not just another entry in the series, it is the moment the series fully defines its identity. Final Fantasy VII, the game that changed the industry. We now move to Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII is often described as one of the most influential video games ever made, and this reputation is not simply based on nostalgia or popularity. It represents a major turning point in how games were perceived globally, especially in terms of narrative ambition, cinematic presentation, and commercial reach. At the time of its development, Square was transitioning away from Nintendo hardware and moving towards Sony's PlayStation. This decision alone had a massive impact on what Final Fantasy VII became. The shift to CD-ROM storage allowed the developers to include significantly more cinematic cutscenes, pre-rendered backgrounds, and narrative complexity than was previously possible on cartridge-based systems. From a development standpoint, Final Fantasy VII was also extremely ambitious and at times chaotic. The team expanded rapidly during production, with many developers working on 3D systems for the first time. This lack of unified experience in 3D game development led to frequent redesigns of characters, environments, and even narrative structure throughout production. Cloud Strife, the main character, is one of the most psychologically complex protagonists in the series. However, what is often overlooked is that Cloud's final character interpretation was not fully defined at the beginning of development. Early versions of Cloud were closer to a traditional confident hero archetype. As development progressed, the writing shifted him into a far more unstable and fragmented identity structure. This resulted in one of the most important narrative elements in the game: the idea that identity can be constructed, deconstructed, and reconstructed through memory, trauma, and external influence. Sephiroth, the antagonist, is another major element of Final Fantasy VII's impact. Rather than being constantly present, Sephiroth is often felt indirectly through his influence on the world and characters. This design choice creates a sense of psychological presence rather than physical presence. He becomes more of an idea than a constantly active villain. This contributes heavily to his lasting cultural impact. One of the most discussed narrative moments in gaming history occurs with the death of Aerith Gainsborough. What made this moment so impactful was not just the event itself, but the expectations surrounding RPG design at the time. Players had been conditioned to believe that main party members would remain available throughout the entire game. Final Fantasy VII breaks this expectation in a direct and irreversible way. This creates a long-lasting emotional effect that influenced countless RPGs afterward. From a technical perspective, Final Fantasy VII also pushed cinematic storytelling forward significantly. Pre-rendered backgrounds combined with 3D character models created a hybrid visual style that defined the era. It allowed for camera angles, scene composition, and visual direction that felt closer to film than traditional RPG presentation. This shift helped establish the idea that video games could deliver emotionally serious narratives on a global scale. Final Fantasy VIII: Emotion Through Distance. Now we move to Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy VIII represents a very different approach compared to Final Fantasy VII. Where Final Fantasy VII focuses on fragmented identity and memory reconstruction, Final Fantasy VIII focuses on emotional suppression and interpersonal distance. The protagonist, Squall Leonhart, is designed intentionally as an emotionally closed character. This is not accidental writing. It is a deliberate narrative structure meant to create gradual emotional development over time. Squall does not begin as a relatable or expressive protagonist. Instead, he begins as someone who avoids emotional connection entirely. This design forces the player to observe gradual change rather than immediate identification. One of the most important thematic elements in Final Fantasy VIII is the relationship between memory, identity, and emotional vulnerability. Characters in the game frequently struggle with understanding their own past, especially as external forces begin to influence their sense of self. From a gameplay perspective, Final Fantasy VIII also introduces the junction system, which allows characters to draw magic from enemies and assign it to attributes. This system replaces traditional leveling balance with a highly customizable stat manipulation structure. It is one of the more controversial systems in the series because it allows for both extreme optimization and unintended imbalance depending on player approach. Another major element of Final Fantasy VIII is its cinematic presentation. The game places heavy emphasis on emotional cutscenes, musical composition, and visual storytelling. The song, Eyes on Me, performed by Fei Wong, became one of the first video game vocal themes to gain widespread mainstream recognition. This marked a growing trend of Final Fantasy using music as emotional storytelling rather than purely background atmosphere. Final Fantasy IX, a reflection of the entire series. Now we move to Final Fantasy IX. Final Fantasy IX represents a deliberate return to fantasy aesthetics after the technological and thematic shifts of Final Fantasy VII and VIII. The developers intentionally moved back toward medieval-style world-building, traditional character archetypes, and more classic fantasy structure. However, this return to simplicity is not a regression. Instead, it functions more like a reflection. The game feels like it is looking back at everything the series had done up to that point and reinterpreting it through a more grounded, emotional lens. Zidane Tribal, the protagonist, is significantly more expressive and socially open compared to Cloud or Squall. This creates a tonal shift that makes the story feel more emotionally accessible on the surface. However, beneath that lighter tone, Final Fantasy IX explores deeply serious themes of identity, purpose, and existential meaning. One of the most important characters in the game is Vivi Ornatier. Vivi's storyline deals heavily with themes of mortality, self-awareness, and existential uncertainty. What is particularly interesting from a development perspective is that Vivi was not originally intended to carry such emotional weight. During testing and early feedback phases, players responded very strongly to the character. As a result, the developers expanded his narrative role significantly. This is one of the clearest examples in the series where player emotional response directly influenced final story structure. Final Fantasy IX also contains numerous deliberate references to earlier entries in the series. These references are not just visual or thematic callbacks. They function as a kind of internal reflection, almost as if the series is acknowledging its own history and identity up to that point. It creates a sense that Final Fantasy IX is not just another entry in the series, but a meditation on what Final Fantasy itself had become. Final Fantasy X, the moment Final Fantasy becomes fully voiced. We now move to Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X represents one of the most significant technical and emotional transitions in the entire series. It is the first mainline Final Fantasy game to feature full voice acting. This single change fundamentally alters how the story is delivered, how characters are perceived, and how emotional pacing is structured. Before Final Fantasy X, most emotional expression in the series relied heavily on text, music, and visual animation. With voice acting introduced, emotional nuance becomes far more direct. This changes not just presentation, but writing style itself. Characters can now pause mid-sentence. They can hesitate. They can break rhythm in speech. These subtle elements allow emotional tension to be communicated in a more immediate way. The story of Final Fantasy X follows Tidus, a character who is introduced in a very unfamiliar world called Spira. From the beginning, there is a sense of displacement. Tidus does not fully understand the world he has entered, and neither does the player. This shared confusion becomes a narrative tool that slowly unravels the structure of Spira over time. One of the most important revelations in the game is that Tidus himself is not from the physical world of Spira. Instead, he originates from a dreamlike construct of a city called Zanarkand. This reframes his entire journey. What initially appears to be a traditional adventure story becomes a reflection on existence, memory, and impermanence. Yuna, another central character, is defined by her role as a summoner undertaking a pilgrimage. This pilgrimage is not symbolic. It is cyclical and sacrificial. Each summoner is expected to travel across the world, gather strength, and ultimately face a fate that involves giving up their life in order to temporarily bring peace to the world. This structure introduces a repeating cycle of hope and loss that defines the emotional tone of the game. From a development standpoint, Final Fantasy X also represents a shift toward more cinematic direction. Camera angles are carefully controlled, voice timing is precisely edited, and musical composition is tightly integrated with emotional beats. The result is a game that feels significantly more like a directed film experience than earlier entries. Final Fantasy XI, a world that exists without the player. Now we move to Final Fantasy XI. Final Fantasy XI is the first massively multiplayer entry in the series. This alone makes it structurally different from every previous Final Fantasy game. Instead of a single narrative perspective, the world exists as a shared space between thousands of players. This means that story progression is no longer linear or isolated. It becomes distributed. The world of Vana'diel continues to exist and evolve even when individual players are not present. This introduces a fundamentally different philosophy of game design. Instead of telling a controlled story experience, the developers are building a living environment. From a narrative perspective, Final Fantasy XI still contains structured storylines and quests, but they are embedded within a persistent world rather than a linear campaign. This makes storytelling feel more like discovery than progression. Players encounter events, characters, and conflicts as part of a larger ongoing world state. The emotional experience is less about a single hero's journey and more about participation in a shared world history. Final Fantasy XII. Systems replacing traditional story. Flow. Now we move to Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy XII represents another major structural shift in the series. It moves away from traditional RPG encounter systems and introduces a seamless world-based combat structure. Enemies exist directly within the environment, rather than appearing in separate battle screens. This creates a continuous flow between exploration and combat that feels more organic and less segmented than earlier entries. From a narrative perspective, Final Fantasy XII is heavily focused on political conflict, empire dynamics, and large-scale war. Unlike earlier games that focus on personal journeys, this entry places emphasis on systems of power rather than individual destiny. One of the most important development details is that Vaan, the character presented as the protagonist, was not originally intended to hold that role in early drafts. The narrative was initially more centered on characters like Ash and Bash, whose roles are more directly tied to political leadership and military conflict. Vaan's presence became more of an observer perspective rather than the central driving force of the story. This contributes to a narrative style where the main character is less influential over world events compared to earlier Final Fantasy protagonists. Instead, the world operates independently of him. This is a subtle but important shift in storytelling philosophy. The game feels less like a hero shaping history and more like a character moving through systems already in motion. Final Fantasy XIII. Linear design and controlled destiny. Now we move to Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XIII is one of the most structurally controversial entries in the series. One of the most discussed aspects of the game is its early linear design. For a large portion of the game, environments are structured in a very directed path with limited deviation. However, this design is not simply a limitation. It reflects one of the core thematic ideas of the game: inevitability and fate. The characters in Final Fantasy XIII are marked as Lissier, beings bound to a predetermined focus that they are expected to fulfill. This creates a narrative structure where characters are constantly confronting the idea of destiny versus free will. Lightning, the central character, is designed as emotionally reserved but highly driven. Her development arc revolves around duty, protection, and resistance against predetermined roles. From a gameplay perspective, Final Fantasy XIII also introduces a heavily systemized combat structure that emphasizes role-switching and timing-based strategy, rather than traditional turn-based decision-making. The combat system evolves gradually as the player progresses, mirroring the narrative structure of characters slowly gaining clarity about their situation. The world building also uses a constructed language style for key terms like Lishi and Falchi, reinforcing the sense that the characters exist within a controlled, defined system they are struggling to understand or escape from. Final Fantasy XIV, the game that died and was reborn. We now move to Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XIV has one of the most unusual development stories in the entire history of modern gaming. Its original release in 2010 was widely considered a failure. Criticism at the time focused on its user interface, pacing, world design, and overall lack of polish compared to other MMORPGs already established in the genre. But what makes Final Fantasy XIV different from most failed online games is not the failure itself, but what Square Enix chose to do afterward. Instead of shutting the project down completely, they made a decision that is extremely rare in the industry. They rebuilt it from the ground up. A new development team was brought in under director Naoki Yoshida, and the entire game structure was reimagined. This led to the creation of Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn. What is especially unique here is that the original failure of the game was not ignored in the new version. It was incorporated into the story itself. Within the narrative, the original world is destroyed in a catastrophic event known as the Seventh Umbral Calamity. This allows the game to literally transition from its failed version into its successful version through story canon. Very few games in history have ever turned failure into part of their own mythology. From that point onward, Final Fantasy XIV evolves into one of the most successful MMORPGs ever created. Each expansion builds upon a continuous narrative that becomes increasingly complex, emotional, and character-driven. What began as a failed launch eventually becomes one of the most respected long-form storytelling experiences in gaming. Thematically, Final Fantasy XIV explores ideas of memory, loss, sacrifice, and rebuilding on a massive scale. It often reflects on civilizations rising and falling, and what remains after destruction. In many ways, it becomes a living example of Final Fantasy's core identity, the idea that worlds can end and still be reborn into something meaningful. Final Fantasy XV, Development Chaos and Found Family. Now we move to Final Fantasy XV. Final Fantasy XV has one of the longest and most complicated development cycles in the entire series. It began as Final Fantasy Versus 13, a completely different project with a darker tone and different narrative structure. Over time, the project evolved, shifted direction, and was eventually rebranded into Final Fantasy XV. This transformation was not a simple redesign. It involved major changes in gameplay systems, narrative focus, character design, and overall tone. The final version of Final Fantasy XV centers on Noctis and his companions as they travel together on a road trip across a collapsing world. At its core, the game focuses less on political systems or abstract fate concepts, and more on personal relationships. The concept of found family becomes the emotional anchor of the entire narrative. Noctis is accompanied by Ignis, Prompto, and Gladiolus, each representing different emotional and functional roles within the group dynamic. What makes Final Fantasy XV distinct is how much of its emotional impact comes from the bond between these characters, rather than traditional plot progression. The journey itself becomes more important than the destination. From a development perspective, the road trip structure was introduced relatively late in the game's production, but it ended up becoming the defining identity of the final product. The open world sections emphasized travel, exploration, and downtime between major story events. This slower pacing allows emotional moments between characters to develop more naturally. The narrative itself still deals with larger themes such as destiny, sacrifice, and political collapse, but these are filtered through the personal experiences of the main group rather than being abstract world concepts. Final Fantasy XVI. Modern dark fantasy and cinematic action. Now we move to Final Fantasy XVI. Final Fantasy XVI represents another major tonal shift for the series. This entry moves away from traditional party-based systems and instead focuses heavily on action-oriented combat and cinematic presentation. The world is grounded in a darker medieval fantasy setting with a strong emphasis on political conflict, war, and personal revenge. At the center of the narrative is Clive Rosfield, whose journey spans multiple stages of life and identity. One of the defining elements of Final Fantasy XVI is the presence of icons, massive summon-like beings that are deeply tied to specific human hosts known as dominants. This system creates a direct connection between human characters and godlike destructive forces, blurring the line between individual identity and overwhelming power. From a narrative perspective, Final Fantasy XVI focuses heavily on cycles of violence, power structures, and the cost of freedom. The story is more grounded in political realism compared to many earlier entries, but still maintains the mythological scale that Final Fantasy is known for. The combat system is fully real-time, emphasizing timing, movement, and ability chaining rather than traditional turn-based strategy. This reflects the series' continued evolution toward action-oriented gameplay design. Final reflection. What Final Fantasy really is. Across all of these entries, from Final Fantasy I to Final Fantasy XVI, there is no single consistent world, no shared timeline, no unified continuity. And yet, there is still a recognizable identity. Because Final Fantasy has never been about telling one story. It has always been about exploring variations of the same emotional themes, journeys across unfamiliar worlds, characters confronting fate or identity, civilizations rising and collapsing, and the constant cycle of loss followed by renewal. Each game is a different interpretation of what it means to move through a world that is unstable, temporary, and constantly changing. And that is why, even after decades of reinvention, the series still feels like one cohesive idea. Not because the worlds are connected, but because the emotions are. Closing. Sleep. And now everything begins to slow again. The worlds no longer feel distinct. They begin to fade into one another. Crystals, airships, cities, memories, all dissolving into quiet space. There is nothing left to follow, no systems left to learn, no journey left to complete. Only stillness, only silence, only sleep.